Hi, everybody. Well, welcome. I'm Andrew Bloom. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Business Development at MediaMind. Excited to be here today, excited to be hosting this panel and have this celebrated group of professionals and experts on the panel. Today's panel is about the quite dry subject, and of course we're going to try and be a first here and create some laughs out of it and some excitement. The subject of how do we create trust with consumers and with each other in a world today, the ecosystem that we live in today, where there's so much data awash and so many consumers are challenged with the amount of information that we know about them. So just to introduce the panel, then we'll talk about a few rules and then we'll get started. I'm joined by Greg Coleman. He's the president of Criteo. I think the world's probably the world's greatest kind of retargeted company at the minute, so we've got fantastic knowledge there. We have Mark Zagorski, who is the CEO of Exalate, one of the best-known data exchanges. We have Michael Signorelli. He is probably, going to keep us very honest here. He's a lawyer, he's an attorney who works at Venables on the Hill. And we have John Montgomery, who is the COO of Group M Interaction. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So the way we're going to run this, a couple of housekeeping items. One is that if you have questions that you want to ask us, there's something called the balloon. I have no idea what it is, but I'm told that there are instructions there. So if you can read, you'll know what to do. Please ask questions. We will have a mic going around for people who want to ask questions in a more formal fashion. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a quick fire. It's a way to get the group kind of excited, to put some sort of gas in their lungs, some juice in their veins. They haven't seen any of these questions. I have the questions. I also have the answers. I'm going to pose a couple of answers to them. They just need to tell us which one is the right one. And I would just say a couple of rules here. If any of the audience or the panel does anything that I don't like, I will be issuing yellow cards. And if anybody on the panel does something to, criticize another panel member or perhaps suggest that they're doing something that's completely illegal, you will be getting a red card. And I have been known to give them in the past. Okay, so let's just do the quick fire. This is just going to last 5 minutes, and then we're going to go into the panel, the proper panel. So first question for Greg. Which of the following segments of the online population feel most comfortable sharing information online? Answer A, 18 to 24-year-olds. Answer B, New York congressmen.
Is there a C?
There is not a C. We'll take that as the answer. Next question. Which of the following cookies are more likely to be eaten up by the new legislation? This question will go to Mike. Third-party cookies, first-party cookies, flash cookies, or all of the above?
Third-party cookies.
Third-party cookies. I take that as an attack on MediaMind, but we'll certainly
give me the card.
But we will not be giving you a yellow card for that. Third question: what percentage of the online population view online behavioral advertising as a nuisance that is worth paying to delete? Everyone. We'll give this one to John. Everyone. 50-50, less than 10%, or only those doing something naughty?
50-50.
50-50. Okay, he's keeping it conservative here. We'll talk a little bit later about that one. Which of the following industries garners more trust with consumers at the minute? Online behavioral networks, offline direct marketers, or the finance industry?
Probably offline direct marketers.
Offline direct marketers garners more trust than online behavioral advertising in a minute. That's a controversial one. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Let's just have two more. If consumers were given an opportunity to opt out of all online behavioral advertising, what percentage would choose to do so? Question to Greg. 10%, 25%, 50%, or 100%?
It was hard for me to hear the question. The noise in the background. Please say it again.
If consumers were given an opportunity to opt out of all online behavioral advertising, what percentage would choose to do so? 10, 25? 25%. You know, it's interesting. There was a McKinsey study that was done recently for the IAB in Europe, where they asked people, how many of you would actually pay to experience the web with absolutely no advertising at all? And what they found is that less than 10% of people saw value in actually paying to remove any form of online behavioral advertising, which I thought was a pretty interesting statistic. And the final question, who's up for a final one here on the quickfire round?
Yeah, me.
John's up for one here. Okay. If the online behavioral advertising was completely outlawed, except on an opt-in basis, answer number one, the world would be a much better place. Answer number two, about $26 billion would be sucked out of the advertising ecosystem. Or answer number three, it'd be back to the good old days of contextual advertising.
The good old days of contextual advertising, which is probably worse than all of the above, but that's probably what will happen.
Yep.
I think that was a great time.
I would say welcome to the world of the Punch the Monkey ad is back in full force.
Yep.
You'll be seeing it 100 times a day.
Exactly.
Well, iBlaster was the first company to put a floating ad on the web, so maybe we'll see a lot more of those again. Maybe there's a floating ad back in the museum over there somewhere. Okay, so that was just a quick start to get guys talking and get some interest going here. There's three broad topics that we want to try and cover in the time we've got here. I've already kind of wasted 10 minutes, so let's kind of start trying to get into it. The first question, or the first area that we're going to talk about, is how do we, or what are the issues relating to trust and data that is causing so many of the self-regulatory organizations and people up on the Hill to take a very focused look at what we're doing here. And to ask the question, do consumers really care about any of the privacy legislation or the threat of privacy legislation that's happening out there? The second point is something that's very dear to MediaMind, is the whole question of how do we actually create trust with consumers as we deliver advertising to them? What have we got to do beyond simply creating privacy notices or opt-out mechanisms so that consumers feel comfortable with the level of targeting that we're doing? And what is the sort of, what are the new ways in which we can create trust there? And thirdly, and I think one area that the panel really wanted to talk a lot about is, forget the consumer for a second, what is it about the way in which we all work together as a group, advertisers, agencies, people like Exalate on the data side, people like MediaMind as a technology ad server. What are the new rules around working together where we can be trustworthy to each other, and by at the end of the day, that means be trustworthy in the mind's eye of our consumers. So, there's a lot to cover there.
Yep.
So let's get started. Maybe first question to Michael, just to set us off here. Simplify for the audience here. What is the problem or concern that is creating such an interest in and amongst the self-regulatory organizations and folks up on the Hill in and around the subject of privacy?
You know, I don't know if there's a specific problem. There certainly isn't an identifiable harm that's happening in the marketplace. It hasn't been able, the Congress, the Federal Trade Commission hasn't said, this is the problem, this is what we need to correct. Like in identity theft, there's a specific concrete issue. People's information is being taken, misappropriated, and it's causing financial harm. When we talk about online advertising, there's not that same concrete harm. But there are concerns that the Federal Trade Commission has identified associated with online advertising, and the main one being that consumers generally are unaware of what happens while they're online, how their data is being collected, how it's being used, and really what the benefit or value is for the use of their data. And so that sort of led into a privacy report from the Federal Trade Commission that's informing the debate at Congress, and I'm sure everyone here has heard about the many different bills that have been introduced. There's probably 7 right now. 4 different Senate Congress hearings are being held, and the focus is on transparency. It's informing consumers in a way that's readily identifiable to let them know what's happening while they're online. You see the self-regulatory programs, many of the companies up here are participating to provide that level of transparency. And I think that's the issue right now facing our industry. It's how to communicate with consumers in a way that they understand how their data is being used, but also what the benefit is that's related to the use of their data. And that really goes to building the trust with consumers.
So many people online are, sharing more information than they've ever shared before. Sites like Facebook, sites where people give surveys on restaurants or whatever it is. There's so much information out there. Is the question that people are actually looking to be paid for the data in some way? Is part of the value exchange here that they don't feel that they're getting enough value back? Or is it simply the concern that somebody else may be doing something with the information, and people just don't feel comfortable about that?
So I think it's the last one primarily. If you came to my dining room table at my house whenever my kids come together, which is less frequently these days, where my 25-year-old and 21-year-old have a debate almost every week whenever I see them about privacy and about what they're going to allow. My older child is not on Facebook. He is very stingy on on email, doesn't generally respond, occasionally will respond to a text. But he's so far over, he's so distrusting of what people are going to do with this information that he does not want to contribute to the man. It's unbelievable. I'm like, how do you think I paid for your goddamn college education? And you're not doing that. He has the same feeling about buying an iPad, same son, doing that. My daughter, on the other hand, the last 3 summers as an intern worked at Facebook. She is one of those that's so out there sharing everything, feeling that the consequences are almost negligible to her. So I should have brought a little clip of those two chatting, and it's a reasonably civil discussion, but both are not budging. Totally open and totally closed. So a 25-year-old not to be on Facebook today is pretty remarkable. But and essentially, it's what I said, he does not want to contribute to a value creation. And I think he's very rare, but maybe not that rare. Doesn't want to contribute to somebody making money off of him that he does not know about and doesn't approve.
Which I think brings up a very interesting point here. And I think we use the word privacy a lot. Like, people want privacy. Well, obviously they don't want privacy because they're all over Facebook. What they want is transparency and control, right? They're willing to share all of these facts and all this data. They do it every day. So it's not the fact that they want no one to know anything that they're doing. It's the fact that they want to have control over what's exposed. They want to have some say in how it's exposed, and they want to have transparency and understanding what's going on. And I think that's the key differentiator here. It's that people are less concerned right now about, I want everything private, because obviously they don't, or, maybe a very small percentage do. It's about control and transparency. And I think that's, as Mike noted, where a lot of the discussion on legislation is really coming from. It's not about, hey, we want to make everything private. It's we want people to have more control or more transparency over what happens, which I think is 100% fair. I don't think anybody in the industry would say that's not a good thing. I think it's a fair thing and a fair equation to have.
But one of the things the industry is going to have to deal with, and I completely agree, is transparency, but also simplicity so people can understand it. But quite frankly, forget about my son for a minute, who's way over to the other edge. The damage has been done. So even now, with a decent segment of the population, even now with transparency and simplicity, people are still, there's a pretty decent segment, I don't know what percentage I would answer if you had asked that question, are never going to trust it because it was kind of the Wild West for the first 10 years of the internet. And those are the people I'm worried about. How do we get them back once legislation is fully passed to really believe that the transparency is real, or do they think it's going to be something that needs to be challenged again?
So I think part of the problem too is communication, and I think Greg, it's interesting your kids' conversations around privacy. It's around identity theft, credit card fraud, and kind of the safety of our children on the internet. It's not about behavioral advertising. We have to separate the behavioral advertising. In fact, it was I was at a conference a few weeks ago where we asked the audience, who here knows anybody who's been harmed or who's been harmed or knows anybody that's been harmed by information or data leaking out as a result of behavioral advertising? Any hands? And it was interesting,
Can anyone hear us?
there were 3 hands at the conference, and all of them were related to credit card theft or identity fraud. We really have to separate it. I think it's a sensationalist press who's actually lowered us to the same extent as kind of perverts on the internet and people who steal credit card information. And I think what Greg said is really right. It's our job to educate consumers and really get them to understand what the value equation is between a free internet, and 99.9% of the content on the internet is free, and us collecting some information which is relatively benign, it's non-personal information, and collecting information. And I think if that value equation was explained properly, i.e. we're going to give you a whole bunch of great content for free in exchange for collecting some of the non-personal information which we'll use responsibly, I think if you put it to consumers that way, I think that they'll probably agree. So I think the transparency thing is absolutely right, but there's a big education job that we've got to do amongst consumers because they misunderstand what behavioral advertising is about.
So back to the point about education, I talked about the work that the IAB Europe had done, this McKinsey study, which if you guys haven't read, I think is a fascinating study on this whole subject. I mean, whose job is it to educate the consumer around the value that they get? I mean, I think it's a somewhat awkward topic. I mean, people who are going to websites every day are experiencing tremendous value, and I think if you asked anybody at that moment, most people understand that they get to enjoy it because it's free.
But if it's the media, it's a little self-serving. So I would feel awkward trying to sell, whether I was at Yahoo or the Huffington Post, selling people or describing to them what they gain or lose because I have something to gain. I'm selling them something. So it's a wonderful thought. To get that back into motion, I think is something that the industry, probably the IAB, should be very helpful with us on to try to regain some of the trust that's been lost.
But I'm sorry, Andrew, I think that's right, and it's one of those awkward things, but we have to do it because nobody else will do it if we don't. But I think that there's a broader education job to be done with everybody, frankly. I was going to say amongst children and, to say how valuable your data is, and if you allow photographs of yourself in compromising positions at parties to be distributed, it's going to hurt you later on. And I was going to say kids, but kids and congressmen should understand. What was he thinking? Anyway, but there's a real education job to be done, and I think it's a really broad thing. But it's got to be done at schools. It's got to be done at places of employment, so that people really understand that there isn't. When people are prepared to share data, different types of data on a social networking site with their friends, to what they would share with a company. And they have to understand that there's no difference. When they're sharing information on a social networking site, they're sharing information with a company. And they don't understand that distinction. And I think it's our educators' job to do that on a broader scale as well.
Which I think it's interesting that we're talking about having to educate the populace about this great benefit, exchange for data. Whereas the question you asked me earlier, who has more trust? And I said the offline direct marketers. The offline direct marketers, there is no value equation for what they do, right? Their value equation is they send you a piece of mail. Where was the initial value you got from the data that they somehow garnered to send you that piece of mail? None. So that industry as a whole has all PII, it has all personal information, it has deep credit information, it has everything that you could ever want, and there's no value equation sent for a piece of direct mail. It's actually worse because it doesn't come along with a magazine that comes along with it, right? You get a magazine which has advertising which is separate, and then you get a piece of direct mail. At least when you're on the web, there's a direct correlation between I'm getting a value and this exchange for values and advertising that's related to it. And I think, that is unfortunately the mistake of our industry, is that we've been drawn into this equation that many other marketing industries haven't had to do. And I think maybe it was just the fault of us not positioning it ourselves the right way from the start. But, that's where we end up. And I really feel sometimes if you take a step back and look at what else is going on in the marketing world, we are such a small scratch on the surface of the kind of information that's transacted on.
Just building on that and maybe sort of pivoting a little bit. I mean, one of the issues though is that there's this what I call the creepy factor, right? There's nothing really creepy about getting a piece of mail through your through the door. I mean, it's annoying, but it's not really creepy.
Well, I don't know if you've seen some of the mail that comes from mortgage companies these days, but they know how much is left on your mortgage payout. They know exactly, your address, all that stuff. That starts getting creepy to me, right? A piece of mail that has all my personal
You obviously have better
information.
credit than I do because I'm not getting those. But I think, one of the things, like we have a guy who works for us, our evangelist, Dean Donaldson, who always talks about, he likens it a little bit to one of the problems with online advertising at the minute, and I'm sure Greg will have thoughts on this, is, behavioral advertising assumes that right now you're interested in this kind of ad because of what you've done before. And if you compare that to perhaps an experience you have on the high street in real life, where you're going shopping, and I'm British and I typically don't like anybody coming up to me and asking me questions. So when when somebody in the shop kind of comes up to you and starts asking you lots of questions, making an assumption that right now you're interested in something, that can be a very nasty experience for somebody. Just because I did something, just because I walked in a store 5 minutes ago and I'm now in your store it's a pretty good assumption that you're looking for something, but you may not be in the mood to talk to that person. I think one of the challenges with online behavioral right now is that people think that it's in your face, it's a little bit too strong sometimes, the amount of information they have of you. I mean, Greg, I know you guys have looked at this very closely, this issue.
We have, but I want to go back to the offline for a second. So for about 10 years, I worked at a company called Reader's Digest, which was one of the largest direct marketing companies in the world. We wound up burning a gigantic bridge because the company went public and there was a need to keep up profits. We actually started to overmail our consumers. And in the beginning, the yield was up, and then it got to the point where we burned everybody out. The mailbox burnout made the whole business tank. And I think one of the things I'm watching in the online world is the fact that responsibility, led by performance, mind you, so there's a nice payoff for it, responsibility around frequency capping and doing the right thing will generally turn out to give the marketer or the publisher a far better return on investment. Because if you did get that same ad following you around the internet for a full week, 5 times a day, you'd want to scream, you'd want to shut your internet off, you'd want to choke somebody. And I think early on, we all were punched out by that, the bobblehead ads and some of the other ones that those of us can remember, that was just completely in our face, first on a national, untargeted basis, but then the targeting. If you're in the market for a new car, the care that it takes from the manufacturer standpoint to orchestrate how those messages are going out, you need a traffic cop to do that. And I believe that they're really starting to be there, because if you don't, expenses go up and performance goes down. So it's naturally built in.
So how do you, I know, John, you guys do quite a lot of work in the dynamic creative space as well. How do you, there are these frequency capping techniques and more information, so that you can, build up trust with consumers online and deliver the right amount of messages. But, when do you start, how do you find out if you've gone too far? Like, when are consumers telling you that perhaps, you're over-targeting them? Are there ways and means that you guys have with the tool set you have?
Firstly, I couldn't agree with Greg more. I think that we now have the technology. Frankly, there's no excuse to over-deliver. We now have the technology to manage creative messaging. If you're behaviorally targeting, you know that once you've targeted an ad 3 or 4 or 5 times to an individual, you can, when they clicked on it the 5th time, you can then serve them another ad, or you can stop serving them an ad. That technology absolutely exists. And frankly, it's common sense. You can talk about algorithms and, is 3 too much, is 5 too much, 15's way too much. And maybe 1 or 2 is too little. Just use some common sense, otherwise we're going to irritate the hell out of the consumer. It's like spam. And we just have to use some common sense.
So what are
to your question about is advertising creepy, and John, you mentioned spam. It reminds me of conversations we had with The Hill and consumer advocates 7-10 years ago. That the concern was, stop sending us spam. Can't you make these ads more relevant? Give us something that we want where there's value. So industry went out, invested millions, built this system where they can anonymously deliver ads relevant to preferences. giving exactly what advocates were asking for. Now the issue is, all right, this is creepy. You're tracking me. You're following where I'm going. And that's really a perception problem. And industry does have a role, like the Interactive Advertising Bureau, to provide that sort of education. And they have. They had their Privacy Matters education campaign, and the tagline was, advertising is creepy. And the whole goal was to demystify these practices. And IAB and the other trade associations are going to continue to take these campaigns and see them through. But there is that one-to-one communication between companies and consumers. It happens in your privacy policies, it happens in in-ad disclosures, or anywhere where data is being collected, where you can describe to them in simple terms that this data is being collected for these purposes, and they can then start realizing what that value is, and it'll demystify the practice. They'll understand it's anonymous, and they'll see the value, and it'll be less creepy to consumers.
Sorry, and there's the other thing is I tend to think that and by the way, I think it's early in the process. We're learning, and that's okay. But I think if we can learn from the kind of do not call and the spam and all of those sorts of things, that would be great for us to use this as an iterative process. But I don't think that we're really using behavioral advertising as a fine tool yet. It's still quite a blunt tool. So I turned 50, which is very old in this business, and I started immediately getting ads for old age homes on the Hudson, and for baths that you can step through on the side so that you don't actually have to step over them, just because I kind of reached this age threshold. It's not really a behavioral thing, but I know it was on behavioral sites. We've got to get better at the process. So it's not just frequency, but it's really figuring out behavior, figuring out proper demographics. Context, demographics, and behavior combined can give us a huge amount of rich information. We now have the technology to do so. And I think very few are really doing it well. I think probably Amazon are amongst them that I think use data responsibly, target well, and don't sell it to anybody who's prepared to pay for it. But that's for me the definition of how you should probably do it well. But I think that we've still got a lot to learn in this business about behavioral advertising and the way we use it.
Greg, I mean, when you guys, I think you've been leaders in, educating people even before, the I button and just with privacy. I mean, what was the reaction with your consumers and your advertisers to that level of transparency? I mean, has it been, can you give any sort of, information to the audience around that?
So you're talking about Acritio?
Yeah.
And in terms so we provide transparency to our users. If they look at the dot in the eye, they can click on it, they can go in and see the number of complaints that we'll get, and we're serving up a couple of billion impressions a month. So we're out there quite a bit. I would say that we get, on average, every month about 30 people that say, please don't do this. Now, granted, we're not putting a gigantic ad up there, and the dot around the eye, while it's clearly marked, we don't create an ad for people to drive people to it, but we do provide an opportunity for a consumer to turn off our ability to retarget them. And again, from a privacy standpoint, we will respect that, we abide by everything, and we try to, again, from a frequency capping standpoint, when you retarget, when somebody's in the market to buy shoes or buy a golf club or buy a car or a travel, we have to be so sensitive not to bop them over the head. At my company, we have 110 engineers just focusing on the when to retarget. So if you're shopping for shoes, we don't want to blast you, but the algorithm that's been developed really understands at just about the precise time when to reserve an ad, retarget somebody, and what it does is it really reduces to a dramatic degree this noise or this "are you following me" proposition. So, and it also helps us to give you full transparency. It gives us the opportunity to buy more efficiently because we're only paying for what we serve to.
So it seems like in today's world, really the equation is to generate trust with consumers. It's all about a combination of choice and giving people relevance. I think, at the end of the day, a relevant message creates a level of trust, and I think what a lot of the regulations and the legislation is pointing to is about giving people choice.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of echo a little bit what Greg says, our business is a little different in that Greg has kind of a closed loop with all his advertisers and able to control that. We, as the fuel for many different types of players, whether they're DSPs or ad networks or agency platforms or agencies, it's imperative for us to make sure that we're also, the underlying relationship we have with those also allows for consumer choice and optimization and opt-out. And even in those cases, we've tried to be as transparent as possible. So if you go to our website, you can see every piece of data that we're able to capture on a consumer. We work with Evidon and the Open Data Partnership, the NAI, the IAB, all those different organizations to allow kind of multiple points of opt-out. Even in those cases, as Greg noted, the number of consumers actually engaging in opting out of information is very low. In many cases, people come to update their information to actually give better and more accurate information, which we are all for. I mean, I would love to have more consumers coming to our sites and saying, hey, look, I want out, or this is wrong about me. I want, this is what is really important about me. So again, I don't think anyone here would even, has any inclination to providing anything but transparency, choice, and, an opportunity for control over that information. We actually welcome that.
Right.
We'd like to have more activity in that case.
Okay, let's pivot again slightly. I just want to now move to the last sort of topic I wanted to cover, which is more around the interrelationship between all of the players in the ecosystem. Yes, it's all about consumers. We all advertise to consumers. We don't advertise to each other. But let's talk about how do agencies play nice with tech companies? How do tech companies play nice with publishers? What's the role of the advertiser here? And I suppose the question I have, and I know John maybe could start with you on this, is has a new sort of code of conduct or a new sort of set of ethics emerged for the way in which we all work together, knowing that there are vast amounts of data available? If I think about, the world of, agencies of 30, 40 years ago, or even 10 years ago, where a lot of the data was in people's heads and people created Chinese walls. And that was the way that you said that, hey, advertiser, your information's okay with me because it's all in this guy's head and he's not going to work on your account. The reality now is all of that data sits in massive profile databases, cookies behind it. And some of this data is like water. It can easily flow around. So how do you create trust as one of the world's leading agencies with your advertisers, as an example, about what you're doing with their data?
So it's a great question. I think that since we've realized that data is literally the lifeblood of our business, we've all started becoming quite wary of how we share data and sort of data confidentiality. I think that agencies and marketers want to collect as much data as they can to fuel effectiveness and insights. And publishers are a little wary about how we would use that because I think that they're worried about being disintermediated. So publishers are legitimately concerned that we would tag our advertising on their sites, learn about their consumers, and then target those consumers off those properties. And I kind of completely understand. We've been working with, we now have more than 100 specific agreements on data and data confidentiality with our partners, and it's taken us 2.5 years to develop them. And it's really to say, we won't do that. Whatever you're worried about us doing, we won't do that. And I think building this trust between particularly publishers and marketers and agencies is absolutely critical, because if we restrict the way we use data, I think we will use a lot of the magic that's on the web. It's a little bit like sticking our head in the sand. Nothing will go wrong, but we really won't move the industry as far ahead as we can. So I really think that it works well for us to trust each other, but have a contract on the side, absolutely. But we need to jump into this thing, and there's so much discovery, there's so much value to be done. And by the way, the consumer is the real winner in this. They're going to get better content. Most of it is for free, and they're going to get better targeted ads, and hopefully we'll stop irritating them. So I think that there's a kind of a win scenario, but we really have to open up the trust barriers to some degree.
But philosophically, and I know Michael, you've worked with a lot of advertisers. I mean, whose data is this? If I'm Procter & Gamble and I'm entrusting my global advertising to Group M or somebody else, there's all of this data now. that's no longer in somebody's head. It's a massive cookie database. Is that the agency's data? Is that the advertiser's data? You've worked with a lot of these advertisers.
Right, and there's no one answer here. You really have to look at the use case, who's collecting the data, how it's being collected, and it's important, as John said, to have those contracts there because that really spells out the relationship. And when we talk about transparency with consumers, you need transparency with your business partners. They need to understand what really the scope of your collection is, how involved you are, and how those flows of data go back and forth. And it's defined by contract. And going back to the consumer, we're talking about ownership of data. There's responsibilities that attach to that data. When you collect it, there's a representation. You need to honor that. And as it travels down through the chain from one partner to the next, those representations go along with it. You have an obligation to maintain that data with reasonable security, honor whatever promises were made when the data was collected.
So I think it sounds a little trite, but the consumer owns the data. And I think that we try and steer away from the word ownership completely in this conversation. We talk about the right to use data. But I think I think a lot of good things happen if we start regarding the consumer as the owner of the data, and then we have to respect that ownership of the data, and we have a right to use the data responsibly.
So I also think that there's a symbiotic relationship between technology companies, media companies, and the agencies, because for the most part, they have the money. They also have data in many cases, but most advertising agencies really don't have the technology to mine that data. And there's a need that I have to get the money. There's a need from the advertiser side, the agency side, to get that. And as we're watching the proliferation of the trading desks and the DSPs, it's so interesting to go into these meetings to try to figure out the proper balance of you can use this piece of technology from my company in exchange for this, and then can we plug in there, and trying to find the equal value exchange is always the trick, right? How do you cut it up? How do you provide the right targeting? And the agencies that represent some very important advertisers, they better know the technology that they're getting into, or if something backfires, it's their fault as well.
Yeah. I think Greg, you bring up an interesting point, and it's something that's kind of I've been thinking about since we started the discussion, is that we talk about data and as this concept of something that has value, right? But data really doesn't have value. It's what you do with that data, how you analyze it, how you crunch it. Knowledge has value, right? Data is just a bunch of ones and zeros. And when we talk about ownership, I would say, you can't, when something is valueless, ownership of that valueless piece of information is, I don't know legally how you would claim it, but it becomes questionable. Where it gets interesting is who adds value to that piece of data in the chain, and then how much value they're adding, and how does that change their ownership of that piece of data, right? So if I sit on a street corner and watch people, go into a Starbucks, I'm observing a piece of data. If I write down the color of their shirts and how tall they are, I'm starting to analyze it. If I analyze the time of day and I start adding other factors, now I've created something valuable. Now that piece of data I've created, maybe that's what I own of it. I don't own the fact that they walked into the store. I don't own the fact that someone observed them walk into the store. I own the fact that now I've been able to take that and make something of it. And I think that's the one thing I think will be the next big debate is taking the raw data and how much value you add to that raw data and what piece of that value chain do you own.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting comment. I think, though, like one of the challenges that we have at MediaMind, we reach 700 million unique users every month. But under the auspices of an ad-serving relationship, a campaign management relationship, we're constantly having debates internally about this data is so valuable, we could go and build lots of different businesses off the back of it. And I think one of the fascinating questions is sort of what were the circumstances under which you were given the right in the first place to have that data, and then then going and building a new business model off the top of it. The question is, do you have that right or don't you? And I think it sort of really goes back to the question of, what was the advertiser in that case, or what was the agency in that case sort of asking you to do in the first place?
Yeah, and let me add, a little separate but related, we've all seen a number of companies that are trying to create critical mass with opt-in. And can anybody name one that's created a gigantic database of opt-in? It's pretty hard to find that. So one of the holy grails, you would say, to get beyond this, to get off of everybody's radar screen, is to be given specific permission that you may use my data. I know what you're doing. I'm getting value from it. And I've seen some great business plans that sound so exciting. And okay, 10 people signed up. It's hard to make a business targeting 10 people. It's really, really difficult to do that. And then also, from going back to the very first part of the conversation, as communicators of privacy and why data is important, to go to the consumer and say, okay, but if you give us this data, we're going to only serve you ads that you really want. It doesn't come off as very authentic to a user. I think that would give you a tremendous amount of pushback around that.
Anyone in the audience have a question? Question at the front here.
Speak up and say your name.
Can you say who you are and...
Michael Hussey, CEO of PQ, a People Search Technology company. My question is, should we be making a distinction between, for example, if I'm on Facebook and I say that I'm a fan of, I like basketball, and I see ads for the New York Knicks, and that's, there's an expectation that that's okay, versus perhaps like offline data that's being married to a cookie pool, and I haven't heard any thoughts on that, and I was curious what you think. And an example might be, maybe I walked into an Audi dealership a couple days ago, and then I'm seeing Audi ads somehow being targeted to be somewhere on the web, and that, when we talk about creep factor, maybe there's a process to get to there if we ever should be there. I'm not sure. So just any thoughts anyone might have.
Anyone want to tackle that one?
So is the question, should we be marrying offline and online data, and is that more or less ethical than just using online data alone?
Maybe not, I don't know, but I guess what should the standards be to, and when you talk about educating consumers and being transparent, I think it's easier to be transparent if you're strictly looking at, the Facebook ecosystem and what you're participating there and the ads that you see related to your participation there versus something offline, or your purchase history. I'm buying cat food, so I'm seeing cat ads. Somehow that's, how do we educate the consumer about that process and make them feel good about it so that it can become there's obviously a ton of potential down that path.
Let me understand the question. So here's what I think you're saying. By stating preferences on Facebook, are you equating that to opt-in?
In a sense, and I'm talking about consumer expectation. I think at first people were scared when they started seeing ads that were related to their Facebook content, but people have seemed to become much more comfortable over the past couple of years. There's an expectation that I'm going to see ads directly related to my participation in the social network, versus marrying, and I know that it's happening, companies like Datalogix looking at offline purchase histories, and I haven't personally seen a lot of ads, but as that starts to happen in the future, how do we manage consumers'
So the
expectations?
only way I would answer that, which may be an imperfect answer, is the fact that setting preferences is not opt-in. Offline or online data around you that's not on Facebook or not as kind of obvious as that, where you say you're a sports fan, I look at that as one and the same. If you don't specifically give opt-in permission of preference or data that somebody's collected about you, liking to go to the Knicks, I think should be used interchangeably and are in the same ballpark. That's my own feeling.
In the policy debate, these practices are treated very differently. Regulators and Congress look at that sort of Facebook example as an interaction, a first-party interaction. There's more of a consumer expectation when you give information to one site that they'll use that information to advertise to you, opposed to behavioral advertising that involves multiple sites, unaffiliated sites, or even offline data being used online. That's treated differently, and the transparency and choice requirements wrapped around that, it's just a different framework.
Let's. I thought the top question here is pretty interesting one. I actually had a friend who tried to start a business model like this. I'm not sure if that person's in the crowd, but this idea that at the end of the day, and I think some of us have alluded to it, it's not the advertisers' data, it's not the agencies or MediaMind's or anybody's data. It's simply the consumer's data. It always is. You're giving somebody else privileged access to that, so therefore it has a value, and I should be in control of it. How realistic is that notion that we own the data and we're licensing it to advertisers and agencies and everybody else? And
I'll take the yellow card on this, or a red card, because I come from it a different perspective. I don't think it's the consumer's data. I think it's the business's data. They're collecting it. There's obligations that's tied to that data. It flows back to the consumer. You make representations that you'll use it in responsible ways or as stated. But it's the consumer data, which then could be licensed or by contract. Uses may be used by other parties. But it's really, I believe, the business's data.
So I would agree with that, and I'll take the full bright red card by saying that there's no free lunch, and everybody enjoys a tremendous amount of free information online every day. People resent paying for it with cash. In the no free lunch, and throw something at me for saying it, the quid pro quo or the payoff is that we are going to use some data, use it responsibly, and we're going to make a business out of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with those things. I think this is not a legal argument at all. It's at the end of the day, we've all spent a lot of time building brands, and if you build a brand, there's a single maxim: what's good for the consumer is good for business. And if we mess this up, so I think whoever we define it, I think we find using the maximum, the consumer owns the data, makes us more responsible. But it's not really about that definition as much as it's about whatever you do for the consumer. And if it's good for the consumer, then at the end of the day, it's good for business. If we use the opportunity to take shortcuts, use data, irritate consumers, at the end of the day, I think our brands will suffer as a result.
Any final questions? I think we may have time for one more. In the front row here. Then we've got to wrap up.
Yeah, Lorenzo, Double Verify. Mark, I actually think you brought up an interesting point when you said that in a lot of cases people actually wanted to go on and refine how they were targeted and to actually update their preferences. I think that's an interesting notion, and it's something that, right now we're trying to create a centralized place where people can opt out of behavioral targeting. Sure. Wouldn't it also make sense through the same mechanism to allow people to refine how they're targeted, to actually put in their preferences? Wouldn't that bring more value to everybody involved and would actually do a lot towards educating people and refining the system and just making it better for everybody? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our system, the same place where you opt out with Xlate is the same place where you can modify. And I think maybe that's the next step for an NAI, or the organizations should be providing that same service. And that's where companies like Evidon and some of these open data partnerships are looking to go. So absolutely. And this goes back to the choice and control, right? I mean, that's this business. The first question that was up there was, shouldn't consumers be able to own their data? Well, they can, and they do. And if they want to update it or manage it or change it or opt out, that's exactly how we do it. And I think, agreeing with John, we need to give them the perception that they are in control, because realistically they are. The tools maybe need to be better distributed, but Google has a manager, a profile manager. We have a profile manager. A lot of other companies now are building profile managers, and I think bringing them to the surface either through the publishers or through the advertisers is probably the next step.
All right, well, good. Well, listen, I really wanted to thank Greg Coleman. I wanted to thank John Montgomery. I wanted to thank Michael Zanarelli and Mark Zagorski. Really appreciate everybody's being here, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.